Folk Studio 451 is proud to present Pioneer History of Orleans County, New York by Arad Thomas, edited and annotated by A. Burris. Chapter 4. The Holland Purchase. In 1792, approximately 9 years after the close of the Revolutionary War, a group of 13 Dutch investors from Amsterdam purchased the remaining parcels of land containing 3,600,000 acres from Robert Morris. This became known as the Holland Purchase. They then formed the Holland Land Company and opened a general land office in Philadelphia to oversee this and other purchases they had made in Pennsylvania. The Holland Purchase encompassed all the land west of the Genesee River, excluding the Indian reservations. At that time, this area was an unbroken wilderness, inhabited only by Native Americans to the west of the river and a few white settlements to the east. It was commonly referred to as the Genesee Country, named after the Genesee River, the region's most significant waterway. Before Morris could give the Holland Land Company title to this land, it was still necessary to extinguish the Indians' title to it. This was achieved at the 1797 Treaty of Big Tree, where the Indians ceded most of their lands on the Holland Purchase to the white men, reserving tracts of the best land for their own occupation. The native Indians were to receive $100,000 for their rights to about 3.75 million acres, and they reserved about 200,000 acres for themselves. It was at this time that Mr. Joseph Ellicott was engaged as the principal surveyor. In 1798, assisted by his brother Benjamin and others, he commenced surveying the lands embraced in the Holland Purchase by running and establishing the aforementioned transit line as the eastern boundary. These surveys continued for 10 or 12 years until the whole tract was divided into townships, ranges, sections, and lots. Joseph Ellicott was appointed as local agent, and over 20 years he had almost exclusive control of all the company's local business. This was all managed from the principal land office in Batavia, with smaller offices established in different parts of the purchase for the convenience of the parties involved. The company originally intended to quickly sell the land at a significant profit. However, they ended up having to invest more money over the course of many years to improve the land by surveying it, building roads, and digging canals in order to make it more appealing to potential settlers. The first sale was made in 1804. It was usual for a person to select the parcel of land they desired to take, go to the land office at Batavia, and make a contract with the company's agent there for the purchase. Very seldom indeed was payment in full made, and a deed taken right away. The common practice was for the purchaser to make a small payment down and receive from the company a contract in writing, known as an article. In the article, the company agreed to sell the parcel of land described, and the purchaser was to pay the price in installments for 5 to 10 years with interest, at which time they would receive a deed. On receiving the article, the settler took full possession of the land, cleared it up, and made improvements. All the while, they made payments on the purchase as they were able. These land articles were frequently transferred through assignments, often passing from one person to another multiple times before being returned to the company. A settler wanting to sell their interest in the land would do so by assigning their article, or if he desired to give security to a debt or obtain credit in his business, he would pledge his article. Tradesmen and speculators of every class were accustomed to dealing largely in these articles, and men who had means to lend often held numbers of these contracts transferred to them by absolute sale or in security for some obligations to be later redeemed by the owner. The Holland Land Company sold its wild lands in Orleans County for from $2 to $5 per acre, depending on the quality and location of the land. In later years, the company often provided a deed to the settler while taking a bond and a mortgage on the land to secure the remaining balance of the purchase money. The company generally treated its debtors very leniently, frequently renewing their articles when they expired without payment, sometimes abating interest accrued and unpaid, or throwing off a part of the original sum when the bargain proved a hard one for any reason to the debtor. Another form of relief for the settlers was the company's agreement to accept cattle as payment for overdue land articles. For some years before the company ceased to exist, They would send agents to various locations on the purchase to collect the cattle and credit their value towards the settlers' outstanding payments. The collected cattle were then driven to distant markets. While this arrangement helped the settlers, it resulted in significant losses for the company. An early school act of New York State required that school districts secure schoolhouse sites either through deeds granting full ownership, deeds in fee, or through leases from the landowners. Before 1828, there were times when suitable land for schoolhouses was unavailable. To address this, the company introduced a policy to grant half-acre plots to school districts for free, provided the land was owned by the company. If the desired site was under contract with another party, the school district had to get that party's agreement to give up their rights to the half-acre plot. Another instance of the Holland Company's generosity, as shown in the conduct of their general agents, is recorded in the case of Mr. Busti, who for many years was their head agent in Philadelphia. Mr. Turner, in his History of the Holland Purchase, says in a note, as paraphrased, "In the fall of 1820, Mr. Busti was visiting the land office in Batavia. The Reverend Mr. R. of the Presbyterian sect called on Mr. Busti and insisted on a donation of land for each society of his persuasion, then formed on the Holland Purchase. Mr. Busti treated the reverend gentleman with due courtesy but showed no disposition to grant his request. Mr. R., encouraged by Mr. Busti's politeness, persevered in his solicitations day after day until Mr. Busti's patience was almost exhausted. That subject was finally brought to a crisis when Mr. R. followed Mr. Busti out of the office as he was leaving to take his tea at Mr. Ellicott's and made a fresh attack on him in the piazza. Mr. Busti was evidently vexed and, in reply, said, 'Yes, Mr. R., I will give a tract of 100 acres to a religious society in every town on the purchase, and this is final.' 'But,' said Mr. R., 'you will give it all to the Presbyterians, will you not? If you do not expressly so decide, the sectarians will be claiming it, and we shall receive very little benefit from it.' 'Sectarians, no,' was Mr. Busti's hasty reply. 'I abhor sectarians. They ought not to have any of it. And to save contention, I will give it to the first religious society in every town.' On which Mr. Busti hastened to his tea, and Mr. R. to his home, about 16 miles distant, to start runners during the night and next morning to rally the Presbyterians in the several towns in his vicinity to apply first and thereby save the land to themselves. The land office was soon flooded with petitions for land from societies organized according to law and empowered to hold real estate, and those who were not. Before he left, one of the petitions was presented to Mr. Busti, directed to General Pole Busti, on which he insisted it could not be from a religious society, for all religious societies read their Bibles and know that P-O-L-L does not spell Paul. Amidst this chaos and the overwhelming number of applications, it was deemed unwise to hastily approve the land donations. And so the entire responsibility for managing this situation fell on Mr. Ellicott, who then had to fulfill the vague promise made by Mr. Busti. As a result, the distribution of the gospel land deeds was delayed for a period, despite the persistent requests from petitioners seeking their land deeds. During this delay, the matter was carefully reviewed and organized to the best of their ability, given the circumstances. Careful consideration was given to each application, and eventually, tracts of land not exceeding 100 acres in total were granted, at no cost, to religious societies lawfully organized in each town within the purchase, where the company still owned land. This included all organized towns except Bethany in Genesee County and Sheldon in Wyoming County. Recipients were permitted to choose from unsold farming lands in their respective towns. In some towns, it was all given to one society, in others to 2 or 3 societies, separately, and in a few towns to 4 different societies of different sects, 25 acres to each. In performing this thankless duty, where many applicants asserted an absolute right to the land, Mr. Ellicott's careful guidance ensured that amidst the inevitable clamor and disputes, there were no accusations of favoritism towards any specific religious group or undue influence on any individual. His leadership and that of his associates remained untarnished by complaints or claims of bias. It is understood the Reverend Mr. R. referred to was Reverend Andrew Rawson of Barry, and Mr. Busti was, by profession, a Roman Catholic. The Bountiful Land. Some of the first settlers of this territory north of Tonawanda Swamp came from Canada in boats across Lake Ontario. Others came from New England and the east by boats along the south shore of the lake. Those who came on foot or with teams usually crossed the Genesee River at Rochester and then took the Ridge Road west. The ridge in this locality had been used as a highway ever since the county had been traversed by white men, and it was a favorite trail of the Indians. Bridges had not been made over the streams by which it was intersected, and it was difficult crossing these with teams. Sir William John, going with a large body of soldiers to Fort Niagara, went along the lake shore from Genesee River and encamped for the night on the creek in Carleton, west of Oak Orchard. He gave it the name of Johnson's Creek, which it has since retained. The Oak Orchard Creek was named after the beautiful oak trees that grew along its banks, which were seen by the first discoverers. Orleans County was originally densely forested. The dry, hard land was predominantly covered with beech, maple, white, red, and black oak, whitewood, tulip tree, basswood, elm, hickory, and hemlock. Swamps and low wetlands were filled with black ash, tamarack, white and yellow cedar, and soft maple. Large sycamore, or cotton ball trees, were common in low areas, while some pine grew along Oak Orchard Creek and in the swamps of Barry. A few chestnut trees grew along the ridge in Ridgeway and other areas north of the ridge. Early settlers estimated that each acre of land in the county averaged 75 to 100 cords of wood, 128 cubic feet each. The principal wild animals found here were the bear, deer, wolf, raccoon, hedgehog, woodchuck, skunk, fox, the black, red-striped, and flying squirrel, mink, and muskrat. Bear and deer were plenty, and hunting them furnished food and sport for the pioneers. For some years, the wolves were so destructive to the sheep and young cattle that it was difficult to keep them. The bears would kill pigs if they strayed into the woods. As the forests were cut down and settlers came in, these large animals were hunted out till not a bear, deer, or wolf had been seen wild in Orleans County for several years. Fish were plenty in the streams, coming up from Lake Ontario in great numbers. At the country's first settlement, white men and Indians caught an abundance of salmon. In high water, these fish would run up the Oak Orchard and Johnson's Creek and out into their tributaries where they were often taken. Salmon were once caught in a small stream in the west part of the town of Gaines. It is related that at an early day after a high freshet, Mr. John Hood caught several salmon on the bank of this stream where a tree had overturned, leaving a hole through which the water had flowed, and where they were left when the water subsided. A kind of sucker fish called redsides used to run up from the lake in plenty. They were taken in April and May in sends by wagon loads. The salmon disappeared years ago, and very few redsides run now. Rattlesnakes were numerous along the banks of Oak Orchard Creek and the Niagara and Genesee Rivers when the country was new. They had several dens to which they retired in winter and near which they were frequently seen in springtime. Lemuel Blandon relates that in 1820 he went with a party to fish near the mouth of Oak Orchard. They intended to stay all night and built a shelter of boughs on the lake shore on the east side, near where the hotel now stands. They set fire to an old log that lay there. After the fire began to burn, 2 or 3 rattlesnakes came out from the log and induced the fishermen to fix their camp in another place. Enos Stone, an early settler in Rochester, said, "The principal colony of the rattlesnakes was in the bank of the river, below the lower falls, at a place we used to call Rattlesnake Point, and there was also a large colony at Allen's Creek, near the end of the Brighton Plank Road. I think they grew blind about the time of returning to their dens in August and September. I have killed them on their return, with film on their eyes." Rattlesnake oil was held in great esteem by early settlers. Zebulon Norton of Norton's Mills was a kind of backwoods doctor, and he often came to this region for the oil and the gall of rattlesnakes. The oil was used for stiff joints and bruises, and the gall for fevers in the form of a pill made up with chalk. A rattlesnake's den where they used to winter, and out of which they would crawl in early spring to sun themselves, was situated on the west bank of Oak Orchard Creek, on the Shipman Farm in Carleton. No snakes have been seen there for many years. Raccoons were plenty. Their fat was used to fry cakes, and their flesh was much esteemed for food by the inhabitants. Hedgehogs were also common. They frequently came around the log cabins in the night in search of food. Dogs who were unacquainted with the animal sometimes charged upon him so rashly as to get their heads filled with quills, which were very difficult to extract because of their barbed points. Before the settlement, there were no natural openings in the woods or prairie grounds adapted to the habits of the quail in this county. It was supposed that they came in with the emigrants. The quail soon became plentiful as the large wheat fields afforded them sustenance. Quails, raccoons, and hedgehogs are now nearly exterminated in Orleans County. A rattlesnake is very seldom seen. The beavers were all destroyed by the first hunters who came here. Those who assume to know say skunks and foxes are more numerous now than ever before, which, if true, may be due to the abundance of field mice they feed on. Before the settlement of this county, streams of water were on average twice as large as they are now, and they were more durable, flowing year-round, whereas now they are dry part of the year. Large tracts of low land, now cultivated to grass and grain, originally were marshes too wet even to grow trees. The marshes were near the beaver dams, which flooded the land and destroyed the timber once growing there. As the beavers were hunted and destroyed, their dams were opened or worn away, and their ponds, in time, became cultivated fields. Quite a number of these beaver dams existed in Orleans County. The largest in Barry, perhaps, was at the head of Otter Creek, on Lot 15, from which a stream flowed north and near which some years ago E.P. Sill had a sawmill that did a large business. This beaver pond covered 100 acres or more, which, after the beaver were gone but before the pond had been effectively drained, became a cranberry marsh. Old people still recollect going there to get cranberries. Near the outlet of this pond or marsh was a favorite camping place of the Indians, who made this a kind of headquarters during their visits here to hunt and fish. As the water subsided in these marshes, different kinds of forest trees gradually came in. Another beaver dam was erected on the headwaters of Sandy Creek, on the farm of William Cole. Another is on the farm of Amos Root, at the head of a small stream that flows into Tonawanda Swamp. Remains of beaver dams are seen in Ridgeway and other towns. When white settlers first arrived in this county, the winters were much milder than they are today. According to old settlers, the ground in the woods rarely froze so hard that a stake couldn't be easily driven into it. Snowfall was not as deep as it sometimes is now. The thick canopies of tall trees reduced the strength of the winds, and the moderating influence of the Great Lakes, Erie and Ontario, helped prevent extreme temperatures. These extremes of heat and cold have become more common since the trees were cut down and the wetlands dried up. Soon after clearings began to be made in the forest, peach trees were planted. They grew luxuriantly and ripened the choicest fruit in great abundance. The peach crop was never a failure, and apricots and nectarines were also grown successfully. The cultivation of apples received early attention, and some orchards, now in full health and bearing, are almost as old as the first settlement. In the woods, the first pioneers occasionally found a wild plum tree bearing a tough, acrid plum of a red and yellow color and a small purple fox grape of no value. For many years before and after the opening of the Erie Canal, wheat was the great object of cultivation among farmers. Between 1830 and 1840, the quantity of wheat raised and exported from Orleans County yearly was immense. Barley did not come into cultivation until much later than wheat, and no rye was sown for many years. It was not until after the ravages of the weevil, or wheat midge, had begun to seriously interfere with wheat growing that the cultivation of beans attracted considerable attention. The Tonawanda Swamp. This swamp lies in the counties of Genesee and Orleans, covering parts of Byron, Elba, Oakfield, and Alabama in Genesee County, and parts of Shelby, Berry, and Clarendon in Orleans County. Originally, it contained about 25,000 acres, most of which were too wet to plow and covered with swamp timber, open marsh, flags, or swamp grass. Oak Orchard Creek drains this swamp. Around 1820, the state built a feeder canal from Tonawanda Creek in Genesee County to direct its water into the Oak Orchard Creek, which then fed the Erie Canal. The swamp's outlet was a ledge of rock too small to naturally drain it sufficiently. When the Tonawanda Creek was thus brought into this, the swamp's level was raised, and the state did nothing to facilitate the discharge, thus increasing the stagnant water. In 1828, the Holland Company sold a considerable portion of these wetlands to an association, which expended about $12,000 in enlarging the capacity of the outlet to drain the swamp through Oak Orchard Creek. The canal commissioners then appropriated the whole of the creek for the canal, and further attempts at drainage were abandoned. In April 1852, an act was passed appointing Amos Root, John Dunning, Henry Mannell, and David E. Mix as commissioners to lay out and construct a highway across the Tonawanda Swamp on the line between Ranges 1 and 2 of the Holland Purchase. A road was made and opened to travel under this act at a cost of about $2,750. As the surrounding country became settled, this swamp became an obstacle. Passing through it required a great expense to make and maintain highways. This large tract yielded but little return to the owners and paid but little tax to the public, so no further attempts to drain were made. The association sold their lands to different individuals, and nothing was done to reclaim this tract until April 16, 1855, when an act of the legislature appointed Amos Root, S.M. Burroughs, Ambrose Bowen, Robert Hill, John B. King, and Henry Mannell as commissioners to drain the swamp. The act specified that the commissioners should allocate the costs of their work to the landowners directly impacted by the drainage. The expenses would be distributed based on the benefits each landowner was expected to receive, with the total assessment not exceeding $20,000. The commissioners began their work and estimated and assessed the expense. This offended the parties assessed, who united almost unanimously the next year in a petition to the legislature to repeal the law, and it was repealed. In 1863, an act was passed appropriating $16,306 again to improve Oak Orchard Creek and the canal feeder. The act provided that all persons who had claimed damages from the state on account of making the feeder from Tonawanda Creek and Oak Orchard release all such claims before the money was extended.
Learn more about this series at pioneerhistory.us.